everybody, today I'm going to talk about Modern and Massive, which is Get Good Drums' latest installment, and how I went about achieving a mix that I'm very happy with. I recently posted a test mix on YouTube, and I figured I would just use that example. It only took me about a couple hours of fiddling around, to be honest, because like the other GGD installments, it was pretty effortless to get things to sit in a pre-existing mix. So I'm really excited to dive in and talk about the processing I did to get there. I'll go ahead and play the drum mix that I have. And I'll take a moment to acknowledge the presets that are built into Modern and Massive. I actually went ahead and rendered the audio of 100% turbo, which I thought was a really cool preset in particular. I'll go ahead and play that for you. That one is a lot brighter and more hyped in the upper mid-range than my mix, but for mine I went for a more, I guess you would say, mid-scoops aside from the snare and darker sound, relatively speaking, just so it can sit in the mix that I have. Here's how that sounds. So what I did is separated out the Modern and Massive kit into 8 tracks here. So we have kick as one, then snare top, snare bottom, all of the toms, the close mic'd cymbals, the overheads, the rooms, and the snare rooms. So let's go ahead and look at the actual built-in mixer, because I have very particular fader levels that I just kind of achieved by ear. This has all been achieved by ear, just listening to the accompanying instruments in a pre-existing song of mine and just finding a place where I was happy with. So some of this might look all over the place. So going back, we can look at the little amounts of turbo that I added, which is a very cool function. I noticed it adds like a compression and treble boost, as well as, I'm sure, a ton of other things. Just really excites the sound. I added a little bit of it to the kick solo. I added a fair amount to the room mono for the kick, just because I thought having that focused center sound for the kick is important, as opposed to, say, turboing the stereo image of it. For the snare, I added the same amount of turbo, or close to it, on the top mic. Then the bottom, I really cooked it with turbo just because I thought it added a lot of punch to that bottom mic. And then the tom shells, I added a similar amount as I did to the kick sum. For the full kit, I decided not to use the built-in reverb, and the only change I made from the stock drum set is changing the snare to the brass high-tuned. I thought for this particular song that high-tuned snare would be really cool. I really like the sound of higher-tuned snares, and this one really sings, especially with that room sound adding to it. Looking at the cymbal matrix here, I just did a couple minor changes. So starting with the kick, here's how it sounds by itself. And here's how it sounds without any of my processing. First, we have a compressor with a 4:1 ratio and a pretty typical drum shell attack, about 26, 27 milliseconds. Fairly fast release, just so the kicks have time to reach that 0 point for the next one strikes, so you don't get this ducking in volume happening. I thought this kick could benefit from a large amount of gain reduction. I went close to 9 there, just in this particular context. And next we have this Puig Tech by Waves, which is I'm just using as a high shelf. You can use any plugin that has a high shelf. I just like the curve that this one has in particular. So feel free to experiment with different plugins. Next is a transient designer that is not working very hard at all. It's just focused on that upper mid-range. I set the duration of it to be around the same time as the compressor's attack, just so you have this consistent accenting of the attack. And with the EQ, this first one is just a gentle presence boost and just a little notch to get rid of something that came up with it that I didn't like. This next EQ is a little more nuts, but it's definitely more of the EQ that helps it shape into the mix that I was listening to. So this was an EQ being used in the context of all the instruments and just using my ear. Some high-end notches to counteract irritating things that just came out with that big presence boost I had there. So without the EQs at all. And with. And then lastly is just adding a little bit of warmth and a little bit of clipping of that digital transient, just to have a gentler transient hitting the master bus. At the end of the day, it's a very subtle effect. Moving on to the snare. This is a bus of the top and bottom right here. I just get a fader balance right here. Again, we have the MH channel strip. I just really enjoy using this on drum shells in general. Similar settings, the release is a bit longer. And then next we have an EQ. It's just hitting that fundamental note. As well as just kind of defining the mid-range a bit in the context of a mix. And this high shelf here just to brighten things up a bit. Next we have a full band or broadband transient designer. Again, I just like to hit that and then kick with it a little just so it has a lot more oomph and it just really pops through in the mix. And lastly, again, for the same reason, I have the tape machine emulation again. For this and the kick, I'm not trying to hit these tape machines very hard. I just want to get the effect of that transient sort of being clipped at the top, but you still maintain that power and punch. So for toms, this is just a pretty straightforward EQ just to tighten the low end and get a more modern metal sound by enhancing the attack and scooping the mids a bit. And next, this SSL channel is just being used as another stage of EQ, this time also enhancing the presence. But I just like the character of the EQ in general when you do boosting. And that's the tom sound. The spot mics, I just have a notch for where the ride is playing because there's just a frequency coming off the ride I didn't like. Overheads. I've been a fan of doing that fast attack compression on overheads lately just to get that snare under control, and then the release being fast is just to get that cymbal to bloom pretty quickly and not have it stay ducked down for long. So this EQ, besides the high pass, just to tighten the low end, I think the important thing to note is I'm trying to soften that cymbal sound a bit. For the rooms, it's a similar approach, getting rid of some of that upper mid-range nastiness. This compressor here is just trying to give the cymbals a bit of a pump just to add some excitement to that room sound in general. And lastly, we have the Snare Room. So with the EQ, it's just taming that low end and adding a bit of that top sort of shimmer, just because that room has a very pleasant sound. I thought it could do with some of that high shelving. So for the room, back to the compression thing, I wanted to have a super fast attack on this, like virtually no transient getting through. I'll go ahead and play the snare and the snare room together in this case, because for this next plugin, this is actually a side chaining compressor, and I'm feeding the snare close mics into this compressor. I want the snare close mics to be the attack, so I'm basically telling the snare room to wait for, in this case, 100 milliseconds before it can come out and sort of bloom after the attack. And then we have our effects sends here. So this verb is just a preset room sound. I have the limiter slapped in front just to get rid of any big transients if I start sending a large amount of something to it. The Saturn's just to add a little warmth and color, just to make the stock sort of reverb sound a little less boring. The second reverb is primarily for the snare, but I believe some toms are in this as well. This reverb is a lot more focused on the treble. And finally, the parallel compression. It has that limiter in front, again, just to tame your transients before it hits the API, which is something I really like using for parallel compression lately. Just a super fast attack, and I really like the way it can listen to the left and right side of your signal separately. I do like the EQ parallel compression lately as well, just because I like to tame certain things that could get a little nasty when you throw it in this wild compressor. Going back to this compressor, it is a super high ratio, fast attack, fast release, and then just everything's just sort of by ear as far as what I'm going for. And while I'm thinking about it, I'll go ahead and play a couple things just without processing at all, which I didn't do. And the send levels for the effects here, like the verb and the comp, that's just, again, by ear and listening to the entire mix when I make that decision. It does end up having more room sound being sent, because that's just a sound that I like. The snare close mic, I do send a lot to the parallel compression and verb as well. Lastly, we have the drum kit bus, which has a tape machine also on it with the exact same settings. It's just another stage of keeping those transients from being too pokey and digital sounding, and I am doing some pretty hardcore attack enhancing compression, so this is kind of counteracting that while still maintaining that punch that the compression gave us. And that's it for the processing. Again, I'll just go ahead and play it with my other instruments. So I hope this was helpful and that there was some stuff that you guys can implement in your own mixes. Thanks for watching and good luck with your mixes.